Hello, it's the Great Canadian Bagel here. I was delayed with this video because last week I did not have enough polling data. I dropped the Nanos poll, so just a single ledger poll, and so it didn't actually have a significant impact on anything. Just a single ledger poll did not really change anything, especially since last week's was roughly in line with other ledger data. And I was really busy analyzing the US election, so I spent most of my free time doing that and not updating this. This week, I was just lazy yesterday, because yesterday was Remembrance Day. I was doing other things instead of making videos. But here I am. We have a new video. This week I did also reject a Nanos poll this week from consideration because I think last week they had a spectacularly bad sampling. It's kind of I can't go into much detail about it because confidentiality agreements with the data pool, but I think they just had one really bad sample week and it has skewed the data. I don't think that is Nanos' fault, but I do not feel that the inclusion until because Nanos is running a 4-week cycle, unless they have a particularly skewed week in the opposite direction, I don't feel like there's going to be any meaningful data gathered from it because I think they had one particular week that was extremely skewed. Now, you might notice that a lot has changed here. Conservatives picked up a seat in New Brunswick and Nova Scotia and 4 in Ontario and 1 in Saskatchewan and I believe 2 in BC. Bunch of seats. I think that's probably the model overestimating things. Because Canadian polling doesn't give a lot of data for by education and by income levels, and since I am using that to help model election predictions, and my model is relatively young, every new poll that comes out that does update one of those criteria, does cause a significant swing. And the last poll coming out that did that was an Angus Reid poll, and anyone presumably watching these videos or any other similar polling content or political analysis content in Canada would understand that Angus Reid is conservative favored. Okay, that's not exactly true. It's more they underpoll Liberals, but they overpoll Conservatives, NDP, Green, and People's Party, underpolling Liberals in Quebec or Bloc Québécois, generally speaking. So that being the last poll that added education and income levels, it has tilted the margins, which is probably made the model slightly too favorable for the Conservatives right now. The only place where I personally would call question to the results, though, is probably Ontario. I think it's probably the Conservatives' likely seat gain is likely still 36, 38 there, but the model does as the model says. I think the New Brunswick results are pretty reasonable. They did come close to taking both St. John's and Fredericton in 2019, and this model is basically saying the same thing with the Conservatives actually gaining vote share in New Brunswick. The Liberals too, but the Liberals are gaining the vote share in the Acadian parts of New Brunswick, and the Conservatives gaining it in the Anglophone parts of New Brunswick, following very similar to the provincial election, which I think is a meaningful harbinger to another federal election. I think we will see New Brunswick, or the Conservatives, pick up a seat or two in New Brunswick, considering the New Brunswick Progressive Conservatives did phenomenally well in that provincial election. Mind you, all of the incumbents did quite well in the COVID elections, but generally speaking, that does have kickbacks to federal. So I do expect it's going to have an impact. Otherwise, there's really not like the only interesting change that's going on here right now. So federally, Liberals and Conservatives are dancing around in Ontario and Quebec, or sorry, Ontario and BC with seat margins. There's a bit of dancing, not really any significant movement there. The Conservatives are don't have any momentum going forward. They seem to be hovering around their 2019 vote share, and the Liberals have gained a bit of vote share from 2019, but a lot of the vote share they gained doesn't seem like it's productive vote share because they've lost seats. They lost. So I guess the best way to say it is it looks like the Liberals are winning, have gained vote share from Green and NDP, but have also lost some vote share to Conservatives. So I guess overall, in general, the Liberal Party has shifted more leftward, it seems, which has made it harder for the Greens and NDP to carve out a niche, and the Conservative Party is conglomerating the center right, the right wing segment of the population is starting to absorb it together. Particularly noticeable in Quebec, because the Bloc Québécois is an interesting party. So Bloc Québécois, especially under Blanchet, is not a nationalist, it's not a separatist party, it is not a traditional leftist party in the scope of Canadian politics. So, generally speaking, Canadian political parties follow the traditional diagonal. I say diagonal, so like picture a political chart here. I don't have a graphic for this because I don't plan these videos that well. This is mostly off the cuff. So picture a political compass chart. So you have libertarian, authoritarian on the y-axis, and economic left wing, economic right wing on the x-axis. That's the conventional chart. So on the conventional chart, Canadian left-wing parties, or the Canadian political parties in general, have been like a shallow trend. So they're a shallow diagonal going from left-wing, economically, socially liberal to right or authoritarian, socially right, socially no, economically right wing. That's the general trend in the past. So like the Liberal parties has been about splitting the difference. NDP have been more left wing economically. Obviously, they're very socialist, but they're not very authoritarian per se. They're like centrist on the libertarian authoritarian axis. I wouldn't call them libertarian at all, but I wouldn't call them authoritarian, at least by their rhetoric and their policies. Same with the Green Party, similar. Liberal Party being slightly more authoritarian, and the Conservatives traditionally have been slightly more authoritarian. And when I say that, authoritarian does not necessarily mean like Stalinism or Nazism. Authoritarian means I authoritarian's misleading. It really should be statist. So I guess that's also not exactly correct, because you can't. I'm gonna scrap this analogy. It's not a great analogy. In general, a better way to phrase this is, as you go leftward in Canadian politics, you get more economically and socially left wing. So when I say socially left wing, I mean uh, pro-abortion, super secular, sometimes even anti-religious, uh, pro-big government, anti-guns, like uh, believe like more pro-security than pro-freedom. If that makes sense. So like this is just broad strokes. There's a lot of very concerned about the environment. Like these are broad strokes of the Canadian left as you get further left. At a certain point, you get so far left that they're indistinguishable from the extremely far right radicals in practice. Now, as you go farther right, the traditional aspect has been less government control, more freedom, more capitalism. If the government has to be involved, it is to make capitalism more fair, if that makes sense. So when I say fair, I don't mean equal outcomes, I mean equal level playing field. So like a level playing field would be like stopping you from just like shooting your competitor to kill them so that they can't compete with you anymore. That's the kind of level playing field I'm talking about. That's the traditional Canadian spectrum. But the Bloc Québécois is interesting here. Though, okay, no, I'll put one more caveat on the Canadian right wing. So the Canadian right wing, like most right wings, is generally speaking religious, is traditionalist, is nationalist, and believes in cultural assimilation. In other words, people who come to Canada should become Canadians, whereas the left wing believes there's no such thing as Canadians and everyone should be able to do as they were. Diversity is our strength, as they would say. The Bloc Québécois is interesting here because it splits the difference. A lot of the social values, I said nationalistic, uh, believes in cultural assimilation, traditionalist. That's fair. Like the Bloc Québécois is firmly in those categories. I wouldn't say they're pro freedom per se. Like I wouldn't say they're definitely not pro gun. That's that's the main one. I wouldn't say they're necessarily more security than freedom. I'd say they're probably pretty balanced on that. As the Conservative parties, for the most part, is more freedom than security these days, and the Liberal Party and the NDP and the Green are more security than freedom for the most things, except for a few freedoms, like they will preach endlessly about quote unquote women's right to choose, but that's the only freedom they seem to care about because apparently the only thing that matters to women is abortion, which I think is needlessly reductive because I don't think that is even remotely important factor for most women. Because most women don't, now I'm going to rephrase that, nobody wants to have an abortion. That's life. It's a dangerous procedure. You don't want to have it, you don't need to. I don't want to talk about abortion. If everyone really wants to know my opinions on that, I mean, ping the comments and I can talk about it in another video. But, what was I? So the Bloc Québécois has, like, been traditionally splitting the right wing socially with left wing economically, because Quebec has been a more left wing province. forever, more or less. Now, this is interesting. Now, sorry. What's interesting now, though, is since 2018, when the Coalition Avenir Québécois came into power in Quebec, it looks like the Bloc Québécois have been sliding more right-wing, as Quebec nationalism has been absorbed to a more right-wing political position. And as a result, it looks like, well, temporarily in 2019, the Bloc Québécois gained a bunch of seats. Now it looks like the Conservatives are gaining momentum in Quebec, and they are eroding seats from the Bloc in particular. Specifically, Beauport, Trois-Rivières, Jonquière, and there's another one I'm blanking on, have all become competitive ridings for the Conservatives, actually picking up 2 of them in this model. I think Trois-Rivières is competitive but not flipped. Or it's the one I'm forgetting the name of. I'm sorry, Quebecers in the audience. There's a lot. A lot of these ridings have like 3 or 4 names, and I'm not great at remembering them all because I don't have riding names. So I wouldn't be surprised if, at the rate things are going, the Bloc Québécois keep losing seats and the Conservatives keep gaining them. Though I think there's an upper limit to this. I think the Conservatives can really only get 16 seats in Quebec. I would be surprised if in the next year, 2, 3, the Conservatives could exceed 16 seats in Quebec, but we'll see. I would be surprised, though. And that's the interesting thing that's going on. And I wouldn't be surprised if within 20 years, as the societal change is happening, that Quebec becomes more a transitions to a proper battleground province for the Conservatives and Liberals into possibly a conservative-leaning battleground province like Manitoba is. So Manitoba right now is the province that tends to go conservative, but the Liberals can do good in it. Right now, or BC, for example, tends to go conservative, but Liberals can also do quite well. BC and Manitoba are what I would call the conservative battleground provinces, whereas Ontario and New Brunswick are the Liberals' battleground provinces, where the Conservatives can do quite well in them, but they seem to tend to default to the Liberals. I think Quebec is going to move into that, because if you look at polling after poll shows that a third of Quebecers will never vote for Liberals, a third of Quebecers don't want to vote for the Liberals, and a third of Quebec would vote for the Liberals. That's not good numbers. It makes you wonder why actually the Conservatives have had a bad time selling their message there. Maybe it's been bad marketing, maybe it's been bad leadership, maybe they've been hamstrung by leaders who just didn't know how to sell the message there. Because new leaders bring in new styles, new strategies. And it's very possible that O'Toole could be selling in the message that can flip Quebec and possibly cause one of the most poignant things if that's a long-term result. Because these long-term changes are the things that actually matter. You get the Brian Mulroney flips where Quebec is just mad about Trudeau Sr. and they flip to vote Conservative for Mulroney for 2 terms, and then they go back to voting Liberals with some Bloc. Or I guess technically speaking it was Bloc with some Liberals. That didn't have a long-term effect on Canada, really. What would have a long-term effect is if Quebec became a province that the Conservatives did well in. because that would erode a lot of the Liberals' seat power advantage versus the Conservatives. Because right now the Conservatives blow out Saskatchewan and Alberta, whereas the Liberals blow out Newfoundland and do strong in most of New Brunswick or Nova Scotia and PEI, and good in New Brunswick, and good in Ontario, and good in Quebec. And when I say good, I mean the seats they win. A lot of the seats they're winning by comfortable but narrow margins, like 5-10% range, because a particular candidate can cause up to, I believe, like a 30-point shift between that riding's candidate, the prime minister candidate, and policy. Can easily cause a 20-30 point shift in an individual riding. So 5 to 10 is comfortable but narrow because it's not a huge margin. But it's not one of those toss-up ones that's like 50-50. Whereas you look at most of Saskatchewan and Alberta, barring this big, like downtown Edmonton or Calgary, most of these places are going, or northern Saskatchewan, I guess. A lot of these ridings are going like 30-40% conservative. So the Conservatives get a lot of votes, run up the vote tally, but doesn't transition to a lot of seats because winning one seat by 40% is less useful than winning 4 seats by 10%, assuming equal population. So keep an eye on it. Quebec is going to be interesting. I think this next election will confirm this trend here. I think Scheer did unnaturally bad in Quebec, actually, for the Conservatives, because he did poorly in that one debate, and assuming it's mostly that the French language debate. He didn't do great in it. He looked a bit squirmy, and it kind of fed into the picture that the Liberals were painting of him, which is never a good thing for a Conservative because the Liberal attack media or attack engine just loves pushing the Conservative candidate into a box, and if they get defined by the box, they're almost always going to lose. Now, let's look at the raw data. So I did skip a week here, and this is for November 11th. This is for yesterday. So the really interesting change that happened, really not a lot. Conservatives holding ground in Quebec, though the Liberals lost a bit of ground. Really, the Liberals lost a bit of ground everywhere nationally, went down about 0.4 or 5.6. Conservatives went up a tiny amount. I don't think that's not really statistically significant. It looks like the Greens have fallen back down again by about 0.24, and the NDP has recovered a lot of the ground it's lost. So while I do think Singh lost a lot of goodwill on his last play, I don't know if it's going to hold on him, because now he's back to where he was before he supported Trudeau through that bullshit, or that stupid confidence vote over a committee procession. He's now back to where he was. That's not a good thing, mind you. Just going back to where you were is not a viable long-term strategy, especially since I guess he gained a small amount, but it's not a good long-term strategy. And he's still stuck around 16 percentage points as his upper bound, which is going to be hard on the NDP. Like, we look back here for a second. With the current numbers, they're sitting here at 23 seats. That's where they were in the last election. They don't seem to have a lot of room to grow up. They're getting one in Quebec. I believe they're losing one in British Columbia. I had to double check the numbers, but it's not particularly important where they're losing stuff. We scroll over here to these trends, we'll notice that the conservative trend is getting stronger, especially if you ignore this point, the 21st, which looks to be an outlier in the data chart. And it's almost certainly that the conservatives are gaining ground at this point. Very slowly. But it's pretty hard to ignore that correlation right now. That correlation is for polling data is pretty substantial. About 0.7 is the correlation. Like that's getting pretty strong. It's actually the strongest of all the remaining ones. All we have, the next strongest one is the block going down, and if you actually look at it, the block's going down by almost the amount the conservatives are going up. And I don't have any, other than these graphs and a bit of polling, I don't have any other evidence to support this hypothesis, but my hypothesis here is those two numbers are very correlated. I guess I could probably crunch the statistics on that, but that's a future update. But in general, I don't think it is a coincidence that the conservatives are going up by almost the amount that the block is going down. I think most of the conservative gain right now is actually in bloc supporters flipping to the conservatives, because generally speaking, barring like specific policy concerns, just like an overarching vote concern, if you're a Quebec voter and you vote bloc, it means you don't care if the Conservatives or the Liberals form government, but you want your MP to focus about Quebec first. If you vote for Liberals, that means you want the Liberals to form a government, and not, or sorry, it means you don't want Conservatives to form a government if you're a bloc voter. If you vote for the Conservatives, it means you don't want the Liberals to form a government. I'm not saying these bloc voters switching to the Conservative Party in voting intention is necessarily because they're becoming proper conservatives, if that even makes sense as a term, and not just a no true Scotsman. And even then, if you ask a bloc supporter, they'd probably yell at you and be like, I'm not a conservative at all. And you're probably right, they're not. That is not to say, though, that the bloc supporters are becoming conservatives, or even that they will stay with the Conservative Party. What I think this is telling us is that Quebec is getting tired of Trudeau, specifically. And I think what we'll see is the next election, O'Toole will perform wildly good for a Conservative in Quebec. And if he wins, his next election, whenever that may be, will not be anywhere near as good in Quebec. It will still be better than 2019, but I don't think it'll be good as this hypothetical 2021 election, which I think is going to be post-budget. That's what I'm betting my money on. So to clarify more what I mean by that is I'm expecting 2021 election probably April or May, once you factor campaign period, the actual voting time. And that will give, and I think the Conservatives, like if we scroll back over here, the Conservatives are polling at about 18.1. I expect them to, in a shocking moment, outperform that by a lot, with the Bloc and People's Party underperforming. Maybe 24%, Maybe they'll be the second largest vote share in Quebec. They definitely won't be the first largest vote share. And probably the Conservatives will flip a bunch of seats in Quebec. But I don't think the Conservatives will win a majority. So then you'll go 18 months, 2023, let's say, in October. Then there'll be a new election, and the Conservatives will go down to about 20% vote share in Quebec, and the Bloc will resurge again. We'll see if I'm correct on the hypothesis, but I'm pretty confident on that. Now, to cycle back to the NDP here, I've been writing on NDP for a while, and while we do have this 1 week where the NDP have went back up, you look at this trend and you look at all these other dots compared to this one is pretty significantly different than this trend line. It could be an outlier, or it could be an inflection point telling me that this linear graph is going to start turning. We don't really know, but even if it, with it right now, this is still a correlation of 0.55. So this is still indicative of the NDP losing support. We'll see how significant it is. Green Party and liberal trends mean nothing at this point. Like, if you look at these points of the liberals, like, these are so far from these, and the trend that these three would suggest to you, tells you that they're just all over the place. Green Party, I think we can pretty much say that this point here, this was an anomalous point, and so is this one, which probably increases this correlation a bit, but probably also reduces the growth. So I think the Green Party is recovering, and I think I would lay that actually. I think the Green leader is bringing some good value to the Greens. It's just a matter of, will that value hold? Because there's always a new honeymoon period when you have a new leader. So it'd be hard to say how long it will be before that wears off and what it might cause or do when it wears off. But for now, it looks like she's having an effect. Though the correlation's blown out because I think there's some big outlier points here, but I'm not going to prune them because I'm not trying to argue a hypothesis that the Green Party's gaining ground. I'm just telling you the interpretation of the data that I have created from the model based on polling. Now, I think this has to go without saying, since I've said this many times now. I put a lot of editorial discretion on which polls I include. I know 338 Canada, he does quite a good job, and I recommend you looking at his stuff if you're interested in this. He does not exercise the same editorial discretion in excluding polls, but I do know he will weight polls down low that seem to be statistical outliers, and he does have an editorial rating number on pollsters. I don't really believe in rating numbers because I can't come up with a coherent way to... I personally cannot come up with a metric that could come up to decide how to weight it other than just assigning like A plus is a 4.3, A is a 4. I'm actually kind of curious how Philip Fournier himself did it, actually, but I'm not going to copy his work. So instead of that, I exclude polls, the particular polls that I think seem to be wrong, and that is definitely more... I mean, there's definitely actual science and math to it. Like, I go over the polling numbers, I go over the results, I look at it compared to previous weeks, to historical trends, to events that have occurred, and a lot of that stuff you can pretty easily detect and drop a poll. Like, there's been a couple ledger polls that have polled Saskatchewan and Manitoba combined in the mid-30s. There's no way that's happening. It's impossible. There's no There's nothing the Liberals have done or the Conservatives have done to cause that much of a vote shift in those provinces. So that must mean that that poll is anomalous. And I don't include anomalous polls because it would make my result worse. I'm actually pretty confident that Philip himself would do similar. Probably treats those polls similarly, but with more math probably, and less gut feeling, but he's more experienced at this and has more practice. As I get more elections in my belt, we'll see how I go. I might evolve more sophisticated methodologies, but we will see. Until next time, I hope you all have a good week, and if you liked the video, please like, share, subscribe, comment below if you have any questions on my thoughts, on what I think is going on in Canadian politics, and really any other question you could possibly ask. I'm open to ears. I have nothing much else to do. Otherwise, have a good evening.